The war in the Middle East has totally overshadowed the conflict in Ukraine. It has been a merciful reprieve for the information warriors in Washington because the Ukraine war has been ending more or less in a severe humiliation as far as the West is concerned. All the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive, the August counteroffensive in the fall have all failed dismally with very heavy losses to the Ukrainians. There are now reports coming in that some Ukrainian commanders are refusing suicidal orders to attack the Russian-Slovakian line, where they have just not been able to make any headway whatsoever. And there have been reports of almost bordering on coup in the Ukrainian army against what they are calling the delusional Zelensky, who seems to have gone totally lost bearing of what hard reality is. There is a severe manpower shortage in Ukraine with a population base of 40 million, out of whom about 8 million have fled to the rest of Europe. They are now at their end of the barrel as far as scraping for manpower is concerned. Any future trying to force mobilizations will lead to a lot of public resentment. The public seems to have had it. The entire infrastructure in Ukraine has been destroyed 10 times over. The nation has suffered pathetically. It will take almost $50 billion to reconstruct Ukraine. How that will happen? Ukraine is now bankrupt. It is only surviving on financial and military doles from the West. The problem is that with the start of the Middle Eastern conflict, the supplies of ammunition, especially artillery ammunition from the United States, 155 millimeter artillery ammunition to be specific, have totally dried up, and Zelensky was loudly complaining that they are short of arms, they are desperately short of ammunition, and at this rate they would have no option but to surrender. There were even talk of a coup by Zelensky, General Zelensky, the Ukrainian army chief, against the so-called delusional President Zelensky, to overthrow him and try and bring this conflict to a close, try and have a settlement with the Russians. Now, whether the Russians would now want a settlement, or that is another question altogether. So, there is a lot which has been happening there, which has gone into the backdrop because of the Middle Eastern conflict has dominated the airwaves, the electronic media, the social media, everywhere. Ukraine has mercifully been wiped out, because otherwise the American and Western humiliation would have been so very obvious. So now I want, with this backdrop, to have a little more detailed look at what is happening in Ukraine, because that is still very much germane. There are three major crisis flashpoints in the world today. One, of course, as I said, is Ukraine. The conflict that is now seems to be ending into either a prolonged stalemate or a major Russian counteroffensive and victory, outright victory for the Russians. Then there is the severe conflict in the Middle East, where the Israelis are now pounding the living daylights out of Gaza. They have killed about 23,000 Palestinians already, and there seems to be no end to this conflict. The Hezbollah seems to be not intervening openly, but they are definitely firing across, creating problems for Israel in the northern territories. And then there are the Houthis, which have opened fire on 24 ships in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden, causing severe problems for global shipping as such, and lengthening the length of the voyage around the Cape of Good Hope by 10 to 15 days with attendant dollar costs. Every container shipped is going to cost thousands of dollars more than here too. This could have a severe negative impact on the global economy. It's already started. Raised the prices of oil, which have started inching up. And even for Israel, the economy could take a hard knock. 300,000 of their civilians have been conscripted, have been called into action. They are not there on the shop floors. 80,000, 70 to 80,000 people have had to be withdrawn from northern Gaza. So all this is adding up to costs even for Israel. How long Israel can continue is also a question mark. The third, hot spot waiting in the wings is Taiwan. If China tries to take advantage of American preoccupation with Ukraine and the Middle East to attack Taiwan, well, we are almost heading for a third world war. So therefore, what is happening in Ukraine will also determine whether the Americans will be able to pivot away from Europe now and pivot to Asia and try and prepare to face the Chinese, or to try and deter the Chinese from attacking Taiwan. So let me now cover Ukraine in a bit more detail. We had taken out this book, Russia-Ukraine War Lesson Learned, in October 2022, the year the war had started. We were then told it's too early for lessons learned. I'm afraid not. This war has been of such seminal consequence and importance that we can't wait for Russia and Ukrainian generals to write their memoirs for the lessons to be learned to be ingested. We have to take note of them even as the fighting is still on, because these have terrific impact on the very nature of war and war fighting in the 21st century. The simple fact is that there has been a paradigm shift away from asymmetric wars. All the wars that have been fought post the Second World War, whether in Asia or Europe or Africa, have been asymmetric conflicts. Asymmetric means there has been heavy imbalance of forces in terms of what is the equivalence between America and Afghanistan, America and Iraq, America or Syria, America or Libya. These have been highly asymmetric conflicts. There is a great asymmetry of military capabilities and technology. So we have been drawing the absolute wrong lessons. These are not high intensity conflicts. They would all come into the rubric of low intensity conflicts. So the simple fact is, we have now come back to an era of not short duration, high intensity conflicts as was the paradigm earlier in the 20th century, because no high intensity conflict, conventional conflict, could be allowed to go on very long, because it would cross the nuclear threshold between the two superpowers. There was that balance, there was that stasis, and which was keeping a lid on how intense and how long wars could be. That's all gone. We are back to the era of World War I and World War II. The conflict in Ukraine has already lasted 2 years plus. The conflict in the Middle East could last for months, if not years, the way it is going. There may be gaps in between, but it will sputter on. There seems to be no end. The simple fact is, we are now back to the era of long duration, high intensity conflicts of such intensity that they test the national stamina and capability. They will need all of a nation's manpower, all of a nation's technological, industrial resources to fight these extended battles of attrition. The shape that war is taking is what it was in the First World War, battles of fierce attrition, bloodletting of an unimaginable order, and similarly, by the end of the Second World War, the Blitzkrieg, etc. had all finished. And the battles were battles of intense attrition between Russia and Germany. And even when the Americans launched their counteroffensive, the Anglo-American counteroffensive into Europe, there were heavy battles of attrition leading to heavy casualties on both sides, and these were becoming very hard slogs. That is precisely what we are seeing today. Now, a number of the global armies, starting with the American army, they had drawn absolutely the wrong lessons from these asymmetric, low-intensity conflicts. They said, we don't need manpower, we need high-tech, and high-tech will suffice to knock the hell out of the Afghans, the Arabs, the Lebanon people, the people of Libya, etc. They were no match. So they said, let's focus, cut manpower and go in for, manpower is getting more and more expensive. So let's cut manpower and go in for high tech. Now we are seeing the exact opposite. The Americans therefore said, we don't need divisions. You know, divisions have been around since the time of Napoleon. They have been fighting major wars. They need an orchestra of all arms. So the 20,000 man division was the standard organizational unit of all armies after World War II. The Americans said, now in these kind of high-tech but short wars, like we are going to fight against asymmetric opponents in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc., we don't need manpower. We just need high-tech to knock the hell out of them. You know, with our drones, with our missiles and jet fighters, 4.5 generation precision-guided munitions. We don't need manpower, we need high-tech. So they did away with the division, they started going to brigades. The Chinese followed suit, the Russians followed suit. And there was a clamor in the Indian army, let's do away with divisions, let's cut manpower. And amazingly, in the years of COVID, we stopped recruiting and we reduced the manpower of the Indian army by about 1,80,000 to 2 lakhs. That's still not been restored. Then we started the Agniveer scheme of short-term entries. Now what the Ukraine war had showed was that these short-term conscripts fared very badly. They did not do well on the battlefield because they did not have adequate time to get trained, integrated with their units, learn on the job, etc. And we were now working on the paradigm of the low-intensity conflict of asymmetric wars, and we, from the lessons learned therein, we were now in a major way trying to downsize manpower. What has the Ukraine war showed us? It has showed us that Russia initially did invasion light, L-I-T-E. They mobilized just about 150,000 men, and they actually went into the number of men they have pushed into Ukraine has not been far over 90,000. 90,000. Now with 90,000, quite obviously, there was no question of Russia even planning for taking over the whole of Ukraine. Putin was very clear. He deems himself as the head of the Russian nation. That means Russians all over, whether in Central Asia or in Europe, etc., are his responsibility. The Ukrainians were, creating hell for the Russian population of Donbass and Luhansk. And Putin was very angry. Putin wanted to, he had used the Prigozhin's Wagner group to try and intervene there to sort of shore up the resistance of the people of Donbass and Luhansk, and Ukraine was getting ever closer to the west, getting armaments, etc., and planning to launch a major offensive to crush the Russian-speaking people of Luhansk and Donbass. And that is what Putin was forced to preempt. But in doing that, he launched a limited operation, in Ukraine, like the kind that he had launched in Georgia earlier in 2008. In 2014, as we remember, he had taken Crimea without a shot being fired. But had he gone in then for this kind of an operation, it would have worked because Ukraine was just not prepared. But from 2014 onwards, Ukraine has been heavily armed by the West, especially the Americans. And therefore, in 2022, it was too late to try that invasion light, a special military operation. If you have to fight, you should have gone full on. You should have gone no breaks, no mental breaks on. But we saw that kind of a tension between the standard Russian way of war and their doctrine of the present chief of the general staff there, who's been talking of asymmetric wars, and he's been talking of low intensity, low threshold wars, Grasimov doctrine. Well, the Russians for the first time have not adopted the Russian way of war of mass and high tech, and they paid a price. Luckily for them, if you go over what had happened when they attacked, by March they had achieved most of their objective. They had achieved most of their objectives in terms of the fact that they had reached the gates of Kyiv. They had taken 90% of the province of Luhansk, 60% of the province of Donetsk. They had captured a land corridor, creating a land bridge with Crimea, which was one of their main objectives. They had seized all Ukrainian ports, less the port of Odessa. The entire Black Sea, Sea of Azov coast was under Russian occupation. So Putin at that time was very keen not to offend his Ukrainian cousins, Slav cousins beyond a point. So that is why he had insisted on a special military operation, Invasion Light. He had not allowed massive firepower to be used to bomb his own Slavic people, as he put it. So in March he wanted a ceasefire, he wanted a peace talks and settlement. Peace talks were held in Belarus and then in Turkey, and they had almost come to a conclusion. As a goodwill gesture, Russia had started withdrawing its armies from the gates of Kyiv. But the Americans stepped in at that juncture. They told the Ukrainians that there was no question of stopping the fighting, no question of this. They wanted the Ukrainians to fight the Russians till the last Ukrainian standing. They wanted them, Russia, to be bled to death. They wanted Putin to be overthrown. They wanted economic collapse in Russia. Now, these were very highfalutin objectives, but it was more likely that Ukraine, with a smaller population base of just 40 million compared to 100 million plus of the Russians, they would collapse, they would bleed to death. And that is precisely what has happened. That is the time Boris Johnson was flown into Kyiv to tell Zelensky that there was no question of him having peace talks. That it was a very opportune time for Zelensky to call it off, because they had fought pretty well, the Ukrainian armed forces, though they had to cede ground, but they had put up a very good combat performance. So it was the right time to take a bow and call it off. And by the way, Zelensky had won the elections before the war on the basis of ushering in peace with Russia. 80% vote he had gotten because of that, and he was forced to do the exact opposite by his Western mentors. So when they promised Ukraine, the Western powers, that we'll give you all the weapons, equipment that you want, mobilize more and make Russia bleed to death. There were reports that Putin has fled Moscow and Putin has been overthrown, etc., etc. I mean, that was all wishful thinking of the most lunatic kind. The fact of the matter is, on ground, they forced the Ukrainians to mobilize. Russia had started the operation with 150,000. Ukraine had 250,000 men to start with. Then they mobilized, pushed it over 550,000. Some people are saying 750,000 Ukrainians were mobilized. And Ukraine then used its larger manpower that it had mobilized to start attacking various fronts along the 1,200 kilometer front. The Russians by then had withdrawn some of their conscripts, and there were just about 80,000 Russians left holding a frontage of 1,200 kilometers. The Ukrainians first started attacking in the south, in Kherson, and when the Russians had no option but to pull up troops from Kharkiv front and plug the gaps in Kherson, the American satellites saw the gaps in Kharkiv, and then they attacked. They asked the Ukrainians to attack there. A surprise attack, even as the Russians were withdrawing to the line of the Oskil River. Now that created before the world a kind of an image of Russia taking a beating, Russia losing. And the Russian army and the right-wing people in Russia were very incensed, and they forced Putin to now order partial mobilization. 300,000 Russian soldiers were mobilized. One of the first lessons to emerge from this war was that between defense and offense, defense is now the much stronger form of war. Anybody who is defending will take much less casualties and will be able to inflict a far higher order of casualties because of precision guided munitions, because of massive amounts of drones, because of satellite and UAVs which can pick up every soldier, every tank from up in the sky. There is no question of hiding your deployments, your force levels, and they will be picked up. And the Americans had provided total battlefield transparency to the Ukrainians. The Russians learned this lesson, that it is far easier to defend than it is to attack. And very, very intelligently, the Russians general Surovikin, Sergei Surovikin, he now was given the task of creating the Surovikin line. It was a Maginot line, three-tiered line, standard line of Russian defense. Russian private companies were brought in to dig these deep trench lines, thousands of kilometers, at least 600 kilometers long, to defend that entire frontage. Millions of mines deep minefields were sown in front of them, dragon teeths were made, and they created the perfect, hardest defense possible. Now, by this time, Ukraine and the Western backers, they had gone on a high based on their own propaganda, their own hype, their own spin doctoring of the news. They were now talking of a Ukrainian victory. So, two Ukrainian corps, the 9 Corps and the 10 Corps strike corps, were created armed by America and NATO and the West, fully armed. German Leopard tanks, British Challenger tanks were given. Later, the Americans gave their Abrams tanks, etc. The French gave their AMX-10 tanks, their Caesar guns. So, a whole assortment of weapons were given to create strike corps for the Ukrainian army, the 9 and the 10 strike corps. And Ukraine began to crow of a major offensive. They began to advertise, we are going to attack and throw the Russians out. Every single Russian will be out of Ukrainian territory. I mean, these were very tall claims. The simple fact is the Ukrainians had no air superiority. Most of their air force had been destroyed by Russian action. And whatever they had been given from the Polish and the other European sources was not adequate to gain air superiority, not even adequate to defend, leave alone gain air superiority. So, in the absence of air superiority, however much of ground equipment you may have received from America or from Europe, the chances of success of any attack against such solid defenses was next to zero. I mean, it was patently obvious to the meanest military intelligence. It could not have been done. Yet, the Ukrainians were forced to launch this attack. They postponed it many times. Finally, this attack, which was supposed to have gone in the spring of 2023, was launched on 2nd of June 2023. The Ukrainians launched their major offensive in the Zaporizhzhia sector, and as expected, they were very badly, beaten back in all these attacks. They could not even penetrate the forward zone. They could not even get to the first Russian defense line, but they took heavy losses. The Russians, very, very intelligently, they brought in their Kamov 58 attack helicopters armed with the Vikhir anti-tank guided missiles of 7 to 10 kilometers range. From those standoff ranges, they started hitting the so-called German Leopard 2 tanks. They made mincemeat out of the Leopards, mincemeat out of the Bradleys. Later, they made mincemeat out of the Challengers. Now, the Ukrainians took such heavy losses that they were forced to call off these attacks. because they knew from the Second World War precedent that a standard Russian tactic is to let the enemy attack first. They had let the Germans attack first in the Battle of the Kursk salients in 1943, and they had inflicted heavy casualties, and then they had gone on their counteroffensive. So the Ukrainians were worried that if they lose all their tanks in these mad capers of attacking such strong defenses without adequate air support, so they wanted to conserve their tank fleets, to conserve their losses, and they called off these attacks. There was, behind the stages, there was a lot of acrimony between the Americans and the Ukrainians. The Americans said the Ukrainians are casualty averse. Now, this was rich, talking of the number of casualties that the Ukrainians had suffered in this attack. Calling them casualty averse was rather stretched, rather a bit of a stretch. But they forced them to withdraw, because the Ukrainians had attacked not only in Kherson, they had also attacked in the Bakhmut direction, because they were worried that if the Russians develop operations from there, it could open up an avenue to Kyiv once again from this side. So they had started attacks in Bakhmut, which were also not making any headway, just nibbling a few villages here and there. So the Americans forced them to pull out troops from the Bakhmut front, and they forced them to launch a second major offensive in the month of August, this time with British Challenger tanks, etc. And once again they were thrashed, badly thrashed by the Russians on their defense line. They could, in the area of Robotyne, they made a small penetration. A great amount of media hype was made. Oh, they're going to penetrate and go all the way to the Ukrainian coastline. I mean, it was hogwash. Nothing happened. The Russians they shifted their troops also from the Kupiansk sector, and they contained this penetration. And now they are attacking it, and they are trying to now clean up the little bulge that has been made in the Robotyne sector. And now the Russians started their attacks all across the front, which is a standard tactical move or standard operational or strategic procedure, that you push all over trying to detect weak spots, and then you attack in the weak spot. The American Institute for War is anticipating a major Russian offensive in the Kupiansk sector. Avdiivka, already they're almost encircled Avdiivka, completed the encirclement of Avdiivka, and there could be sudden breakdown in morale there, and sudden deep penetration could occur. It's all over bar the shouting as far as Ukraine is concerned. It's all over bar the shouting. Especially after 7th October, Ukraine has been vociferously complaining that they are not getting ammunition, they are not getting the kind of weapons and equipment that were promised. We find in the United States itself, the Republicans have blocked all weapon consignments, not only to Ukraine but also to Israel. The bulk of those consignments were not going to Israel. They were going, 80% or almost thereabouts was going to Ukraine. All that has been blocked by the Republicans. They are not letting the legislation get through till the Mexico border is sealed. And to that extent, there is a total chokehold there on further weapons, equipment and supplies. And ammunition is the dire problem as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. And if they don't get ammunition, it could be disaster on the battlefield. They may have to just lay down arms. It is that bad. Fortunately, it has been hidden from the world because all attention has been diverted to the Middle East, and they have coolly washed their hands off the Ukraine front. So what happens next? Where do we go from here? The simple fact is that America is now getting worried that escalation could take place in the Middle East. It could bog down a lot more of their resources, which would be required in case China attacks Taiwan. So the Americans are now keen to pivot to Asia, where the next set of problems is likely to arise, and all in an election year. 3 raging battles in an year of elections. I think it was very, I would say, strategically short-sighted of the United States. Professor Mearsheimer, Henry Kissinger had all been telling them not to open 2 fronts at the same time. But that advice was unheeded, and there was even talk that we can handle two fronts, we can handle Russia and China together. Now you have to also handle the Middle East. So the Americans want to pivot to Asia. If they pivot to Asia, well, then there is the risk that of a great loss of face. If Ukraine goes down under, the whole of the West loses face. So now what it appears is that the Americans have worked out a strategy wherein Europe will now do the heavy lifting in Ukraine, and the Americans will pivot out from Ukraine and go head towards the Asiatic front, reinforce Philippines, go push more troops or materials towards Japan, Okinawa, etc. Because they'll have to posture towards Taiwan, because if China attacks Taiwan, that could become the main theatre of war, and that could happen as early as April, May 2024, because of the simple fact that the tide conditions, the Met conditions are going to be absolutely right then. The elections have taken place in Taiwan, and the DPP candidate has won, Li Kai has won, and the Chinese are pretty angry and miffed about this, the separatist candidate winning the elections in Taiwan. So they may just well decide this is the most opportune moment to attack Taiwan, because America is heavily bogged down, and if Iran steps up on the gas in the Middle East, the Americans will have to divert minimum 2 to 3 carrier battle groups towards that side, and a lot of other precision guided munitions and other resources if Iran enters the fray. So the Americans have been trying to get out of there and pivot to Asia, and what we saw was that just like Boris Johnson had come in March 2022 to tell Ukraine not to have a peace talks with Russia, not to have a peace deal with Russia, and to continue the fighting and the bloodletting. So now Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has just been to Kyiv, and in all probability he's told the Ukrainians, you are not going to be dumped, you are not going to be let down, and we will give you weapons and equipment. Keep fighting, make the Russians bleed. The unfortunate problem is the poor people of Ukraine have had it. Almost the entire infrastructure of Ukraine has been destroyed, cities have been flattened, and now Russia, with the help of its tactical ballistic missiles, its cruise missiles, and the drones, swarms of drones, including the Shahid Iranian drones, have been hitting the cities of Ukraine, and they are likely to launch their major counteroffensive. What the best case scenario for the Americans and for the West is a frozen conflict a la Korea. But will the Russians accept that now? Because they have been needled so much. So therefore we find that in NATO, they are now trying to posture to tell Russia not to push too hard or too far. So there is this major exercise of 90,000 NATO troops being planned in Europe as a kind of a deterrence measure to tell Russia not to cross the line or not to pummel the Ukrainians too hard or too far. But I am not very sure if the Russians will stop, because even Putin is very incensed because they have given the HIMARS and other cruise missiles to the Ukrainians, with the help of which they have been hitting Crimea, and they have been hitting Russian cities, including Moscow, with these small tactical drones. The damage caused may not have been very much, but the simple fact is that that makes a statement, and which sort of detracts from Russian credibility as a military power, as a great military power. So even Putin is very incensed, and he would now like to create a kind of a cordon sanitaire, from which beyond which he'll try to push the Ukrainians and all American supplied weapons or European supplied weapons, so that they cannot engage the mainland of Russia. So that might imply a major counteroffensive in the month of February, March, which the Russians could launch. They had mobilized 300,000 reservists, with the help of which they had manned the Surovikin line and beaten back all the counteroffensives of the Ukrainians. Now they have mobilized about 270,000 more reservists, and with the help of which they could launch a major counteroffensive. It could go in the direction of Kupiansk and possibly towards Kharkiv, as the Americans are saying. It could also cross the Dnieper, and it could also even head for Odessa. Most likely they'll go in for the Kupiansk strategic direction and even try and threaten Kyiv. But as far as Ukraine is concerned, they have more or less, they are about to throw in the towel. They are just being buttressed by the Europeans. They are trying to tell them not to cave in and collapse, because there will be a lot of loss of face for the West, for the United States as well as NATO, because they tried to egg Ukraine on to take on Russia, and Ukraine has taken a hell of a beating. It's been very unfair to the people of Ukraine and even to the armed forces of Ukraine. They have performed heroically, but they have been battered. The very nature of war is such that it is an attrition-oriented campaign, where the side with the larger manpower, the side with the larger technological base, industrial mobilization will win the day. The Russians clearly are winning the day there, because now they have mobilized their manpower, and which was their error that they had made to start with. They tried to do invasion light, go in just with 90,000 troops and finish the job. I'm afraid that does not work. These long duration, high intensity conflicts are a severe test of national stamina and resolve to stay the course. And Russia has clearly shown that. Ukraine was dependent upon outside powers to help it stay the course. Now America has other things to do. So Ukraine was almost getting dumped. The Europeans are now trying to step in to fill the breach. How much Europe can do alone remains to be seen. And there are now chances of an escalation all over the world, in Ukraine, in Middle East, and if Taiwan Straits erupt, well, we are into Third World War. World War III is upon us. What are the specific lessons learned for India? We have two major conventional military adversaries, China and Pakistan. Two major conventional adversaries. Despite the severe economic problems that Pakistan has faced, its armed forces are alive and kicking. And we have just seen the kind of strike that they launched against Iran. They may not be capable of taking a sustained conflict, but in the short term, they are capable of doing a lot of damage. Most of the wars, if wars erupt or conflict erupts with China and Pakistan, most of it will be fought in the mountains, which eat up troops. So we have to technologically add a lot of more armaments, but this is the era of not just high tech, it is also now the era of mass. Let us stop any of that asymmetric warfare era thinking. Let's not do away with divisions, because Russia has started using divisions right back. Other countries will follow suit. Fortunately for India, most of our organizations were legacies of World War II. We had inherited those organizations from World War II. We now wanted to do away with them because of that asymmetric nature of wars that we had seen. Everybody thought manpower is a big waste of money. But the fact of the matter is, the world has come right back to the kind of war fighting that we saw in World War II. So our existing organizations of the Indian Army are quite perfect. Let's not tamper with them any longer, because the world is back to the era of World War II. Let us not reduce our manpower, because like I said, mountains eat up troops. You need 10:1 superiority in the mountains, or if you have to fight in urban terrain like Lahore or Sialkot, you need 10:1 superiority. So how can we cut about 200,000 men from the Indian Army? And then we have gone in for short-term inductees, the Agniveers. How well they'll do in combat remains to be seen. But definitely it militates against integration with their units, especially for crew-served weapons. There are problems. So we'll have to give it a rethink, because the entire paradigm of war has changed. No asymmetric wars now, no low intensity conflict. Conflict would be high intensity and long duration. It will be a test of national stamina and willpower. And for that we'll need both mass and both high tech. India has no dearth of manpower, but if we cut our own manpower, we are cutting our own tail, we are doing damage to ourselves. And also we are cutting away jobs when they are severely needed. So though India has taken some right steps, we are increasing the number of our drones, the sophistication of our drones. We have the Army Chief General Narwane had years ago foreseen this, and now we are adding to our inventory of drones. We are trying to strengthen the Indian Air Force. We are trying to go in for the generation next of our Tejas aircraft, and then Tejas Mark II will also be coming in. We have increased the number of Su-30s that we have. We are increasing the number of our cruise missiles and our tactical ballistic missiles. We must rapidly increase the number of our 155mm guns and mediumize our artillery, because that is a key war-winning factor now, as has been shown in Ukraine. Wise people learn from the experience of others. Only fools learn at their own cost. We are a very wise people, the Indians, and I'm sure we will, or we already have drawn our lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war and the ongoing fracas in the Middle East. Thank you.